Rollin. Today we are joined by society leader Hugh Taft-Morales. Hugh will explore how we can more effectively and inclusively work toward racial justice. His address is titled Color Lines. Hugh.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for being here. So, as we start Black History Month, I want to thank those Black Americans who, through their writings or their conversations with me, have helped me understand racism in this country. Whatever wisdom I might offer today is greatly due to them. Second, I want to acknowledge that racism is complicated. It comes in many forms. So please forgive the inevitable oversimplifications or mistakes I will make today. I'm still learning. And third, the color line is both very real, physical, in law, and it's a metaphor. So that's going to range today through all of these areas. So let me start. I'll start back where I often do, my youth. In the 60s, growing up, my sense of justice grew out of the civil rights movement. Desegregation on buses, at lunch counters, in schools dominated my understanding of right and wrong. My heroes were those who protested by crossing physical barriers known as the color line. Now, as an adult, I learned more about how the color line cut into me as a psychological force. I certainly learned how it cleaved Black Americans in two. Many felt both free and still enslaved. Many felt that they were suffering a two-ness. That was a word that DuBois, W.B. Du Bois, talked about, a double consciousness. When I became a director of diversity at a small private school, that sense of two-ness began to come into me. I was a well-meaning liberal working for equality and inclusion, but I was also a representative of a primarily white institution who could never really understand the discomfort families of color endured navigating through this primarily white school. Liberal communities across the country today are mired in conversations about who's woke and who's not, and whether wokeness is a good thing or not. These debates are sapping our energy and inhibiting real progress on racial justice. So I want to do better myself. I want us to do better. So I'm going to do something I love to do, which is dip into history. So I think there are lessons from centuries ago that'll help us understand the physical, political, and psychological manifestations of the color line. I hope that it will help us commit to doing even better on what we try to do here in ethical society, and that is to create an environment where we can deconstruct oppression so that we honor the worth of every person. That's our goal. So, one of my very first lessons about the color line I drew out of my American heritage Civil War board game called Battle Cry. The color line that dominated my thoughts was between the blue and the gray, the North and the South. I watched Civil War films, I read Stephen Crane's The Red Badge of Courage, and they all centered white people. They taught that the Civil War defeated racism, and we're moving forward. Later, as I studied in high school and college, I began to see that the color line arose through Jim Crow laws after the Civil War. It constructed American apartheid. While chattel slavery ended, Black sharecroppers were caught in a web of restrictions that, although they were technically emancipated, they were not free. Fredrick Douglass, citing Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, wrote, "The colored man is the Jean Valjean of American society. He has ceased to be a slave of an individual, but he has in some sense become a slave of society." Now, the term color line began coming in newspapers after the Civil War, Douglass wrote an article entitled "The Color Line," and it explained how, quote, "out of the depths of slavery has come this prejudice and this color line. It separated human beings into those who were worthy of respect and those who were not. The color line," Douglass said, quote, "simply advertised the objects of oppression, insult, and persecution." So the color line was omnipresent. Douglass writes how it existed, quote, "in nearly every department of American life. It fills the air. It meets black people at the workshop, the factory, when they apply for work. It meets them at the church, the hotel, the ballot box, and worst of all, it meets them at the jury box," end quote. Now, as the Great Migration drove many black Americans north, the color line followed. Langston Hughes wrote that, quote, "in Cleveland, a liberal city," he says, "the color line began to be drawn tighter and tighter. Theaters and restaurants in the downtown area began to refuse to accommodate colored people. Landlords doubled and tripled their rent at the approach of a dark tenant," end quote. According to DuBois, in Philadelphia, the color line divided black citizens from their white allies. There were a lot of connective tissue in the abolition movement in Philadelphia. But segregation began to corrode even those relationships. In his 1899 work, The Philadelphia Negro, DuBois wrote, "In all walks of life, the Negro is liable to meet some objection to his presence or some discourteous treatment, and the ties of friendship or memory seldom are strong enough to hold across the color line. He faces the dilemma of whether or not to enter white-dominated spaces. He says if he enters, he is liable to have his feelings hurt and get into an unpleasant altercation. But if he doesn't, he can be blamed for indifference." So this division is beginning to get deeper into the psyche of everyone. The NAACP's magazine, The Crisis, of which DuBois was the editor, began to feature a regular column called Along the Color Line. It consisted of news reports from around the country of racialized violence, and it tried to point black Americans towards constructive opportunities available in education, industry, politics, church, military, personal issues, social uplift, he called it, in music and art. Now, Du Bois's brilliance allowed him to cross over the color line into the intellectual world of the United States and Europe. He wrote, I love this passage, "Across the color line I move arm in arm with Balzac and Dumas, where smiling men and welcoming women glide in gilded halls. I summon Aristotle and Aurelius and what soul I will, and they come all graciously with no scorn nor condescension. So, wed to the truth, I dwell above the veil." Unfortunately, DuBois realized that the veil, which was a form of the color line, denied him full inclusion. Despite his fame, he never felt at home in America. He asks, "Why did God make me an outcast and a stranger in mine own house? The shades of the prison house closed round all of us. Walls straight and stubborn to the whitest, but relentlessly narrow, tall, and unscalable to sons of night who must plod darkly on in resignation or beat unavailingly palms against the stone or steadily, half hopelessly, watch the streak of blue above." Contemporary black scholars still experience this. They have to beat their palms against the stone. John Hope Franklin, who died a couple of years ago, bemoaned the uneven progress of civil rights. The day after the Los Angeles police officers who brutally beat Rodney King were found not guilty, Franklin spoke out, and his speech became a book entitled The Color Line, Legacy for the 21st Century, which documented the inequality of housing, healthcare, education, and income. Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. beat his palm against the stone in 2009, though he escaped physical injury. The color line led to his being racially profiled and arrested in front of his own house. It was particularly ironic given the success of his award-winning PBS series, America Beyond the Color Line, which explored the legal and de facto disparities still wounding Black Americans. Black bodies in the wrong time at the wrong place, victimized by police brutality, birthed the Black Lives Matter movement. And it seemed, at least to me at that point, that we were at an inflection point, that things were going to fundamentally change. But today, with the pandemic having made all physical manifestations and income inequality more strong, the color line remains with us. And in addition to its physical manifestations, the color line is in politics, clearly, from voter suppression to fear-mongering. Now, the first time the color line as a term was used in a political reference was back in July 7th, 1869, when the Richmond Dispatch described a color line between two white candidates running for governor. Henry H. Wells, who supported black rights and had a lieutenant governor running with him, J.D. Harris, Black American. Well, Wells lost to Gilbert Walker, who was hailed as the savior of white nobility and power. The racial dynamics were very clear on the front page of the Richmond Dispatch. It read, "Never in this country was there so proud a victory as that won in the state yesterday by the friends of personal liberty and just and orderly government. The allies of corruption and incompetence are routed. Rejoice, Virginians, for your noble old mother is saved from misrule, degradation, and ruin. Richmond is redeemed." So, Southern redeemers, that was a term used in history, rewrote the history to portray the Confederacy as the most noble incarnation of American values. And the Redeemers described the ex-Confederates regaining political power as a virtuous resistance to the corrupt black politicians and their opportunistic Northern allies. Now, the color line was most famously used, however, in 1900 at the first Pan American Conference, when DuBois took on a global perspective. And I think we forget that global perspective quite often. He helped craft what was known as the Address to the Nations of the World, which declared that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. The term was then used in the context of liberation movements, rebelling from colonial rule around the globe. He said, this document said, the color line arose within the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa, in America and the islands of the sea. And DuBois understood how capitalism and colonialism had fueled racism and still did. And he supported the African people demanding independence, and he became a socialist. Well, in 1951, as the McCarthy hysteria was boiling, DuBois was ostracized politically. He was harassed and arrested for being an agent of the Soviet Union merely because he circulated a petition protesting nuclear weapons. The NAACP said the incident was, quote, one of the most ludicrous actions ever taken by the American government. Although I think there is a long list of competitors in that. Now, persecuted for his left-wing politics, abandoned by white liberals who thought he was too radical, and struggling with the government to control his own passport, he moved to Ghana. He died there on August 27, 1963, a virtual political exile. The very next day, at the March on Washington, NAACP's Roy Wilkins told the crowd that at the dawn of the 20th century, DuBois was, quote, the voice that was calling you here today in this cause. Beyond its physical and political manifestations, the color line impacted Black Americans psychologically, and that's what I want to focus on for a bit. Now, as a child in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, DuBois was spared. He was at that point more of a novelty than a threat. But when he went to college in Tennessee, then things changed. And he had experiences like those of John Jones, a fictional character in his book, The Souls of Black Folk. And it describes a dawning awareness. This is from that chapter 13. He looked not for the first time sharply about him and wondered he had seen so little before. He grew slowly to feel almost for the first time the veil that lay between him and the white world. He first noticed now the oppression that had not seemed oppression before. Differences that erstwhile seemed natural, restraints and slights that in his boyhood days had gone unnoticed or been greeted with a laugh. He felt angry now when men did not call him Mister. He clenched his hand at the Jim Crow laws. He chafed at the color line that hemmed in him and his. A tinge of sarcasm crept into his speech and a vague bitterness into his life, and he sat long hours wondering and planning a way around these crooked things. These crooked things. So many black people I know today share similar stories. They speak of the time and energy required to navigate around crooked things in mainstream society. They try to learn implicit codes, such as the dominant culture has in variations of, quote, linguistic forms, communicative strategies, and presentation of the self. They learn how to speak and who to speak to so they don't trigger fear or reprisal. And it's exhausting and infuriating, they tell me. Now, while he was confident in his ability as a political force, DuBois was judged by white society. He found himself, quote, looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. He did what many folks of color tell me they do. They developed two personas, a public one adept at code switching and a private one revealed in all black or mostly black communities. And DuBois said his consciousness was cut in half. He says, it is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness. One ever feels his two-ness, an American and Negro. Two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder, end quote. So this inner division, which is caused by and reinforces racism, attacked his psychic unity and does so for many black people in America. It was so painful for DuBois that when his son of 2 years old contracted diphtheria and died, he said, at least his son would be saved from a life of indignities. This insidious nature of racism can infect every cell of one's body. In 1881, Fredrick Douglass described it, the color line, as a disease. Somehow Douglass managed, at least on the outside, to remain healthy and whole. Despite the insults and the whippings when enslaved, his sense of self remained strong. And I marvel at how Douglass able to, and so many others, to maintain their self-esteem in that system. Now, maybe it was because he says that he didn't internalize racism. DuBois wrote that racial prejudice in the color line, his article, he said that it was not inherent in human beings or society. He understood that the color line arises in particular times for particular reasons. And he said it was neither a part of him nor inevitable. He wrote, it is American, not European. Local, not general, limited, not universal, and must be ascribed to artificial conditions, not to any fixed or immutable law of nature. Now, obviously, there are elements of racism everywhere in the world, but he was talking about a very specific type of racism in America. Because he wrote about going to Europe, and he said, in Europe, A black person mingles with the multitude unquestioned, end quote. And experiences outside of the U.S. allowed for Douglass to see that the color line was in the world, not in him. And it helped him manage the physical and psychological and political manifestations of the color line. Now, white people struggle with the color line too. And that's where I want to turn to. Most white people agree that anti-racism must center those who are most affected. We need to correct disparities in healthcare and criminal justice, deconstruct the color line as it arises in de facto segregation in our cities, understand how intergenerational self-theft has led to the racialization of poverty in this country, when the average wealth of the average black family is 10 times less than the average wealth of the average white family in America. We have to deal with how racism arises in elections, in priorities of city budgets, and understand how redlining created neighborhoods where folks that are not part of the dominant race in that area don't feel comfortable. I mean, plenty of black people have told me they don't feel comfortable coming to Rittenhouse Square, like I might not feel comfortable going to some parts of North Philly. So this is real, this is here. So to fight racism effectively, I think white folks need to work on the psychological impact of the color line. Not all whites experience things the same, but for many whites, they feel their own unity shattered by the color line. Everybody has different experiences of this, I know that. And we need to do a better job of acknowledging the diversity of experiences. But I will suggest that for most white people, racism weighs us down. Certainly people here know that. And Douglass noticed that how often white people struggle to talk about racism, even his allies working with Douglass. He suggested, this was his theory from over 140 years ago, that this was because they knew that deep inside, centuries of racial exploitation had created a debt owed to black Americans, a debt that remains largely unpaid. Now that word debt is a trigger word. Reparations, what does it mean? Who owes that debt? I don't, so on and so forth. And that debate creates tension. Douglass argued, though, he said, quote, "A man without the ability or disposition to pay a just debt does not feel at ease in the presence of his creditor. He does not want to meet him on the street or in the marketplace. Such meeting makes him uncomfortable." So it made me think that maybe there are strategies to avoid that discomfort. One way is to keep the races separate. If you're not around folks of different races, it's easier to ignore any debt that you might think exists. So de facto segregation minimizes that discomfort. DuBois believed that white people also minimize discomfort, a natural thing to do. It's not something you want. But they did so by framing the problem as being outside of themselves. After the Civil War, white lawmakers did this. According to DuBois, they framed the problem with this question. This is DuBois's question from the words of white lawmakers in the South. What shall be done with the Negroes? Right? Ship them back to Africa. This was similar to how government officials actually talked about the Indian problem. You might have heard that phrase. The Indian problem was about the very existence of Native Americans. They were the problem. So DuBois describes even sympathetic whites who, quote, approach me in a half-hesitant sort of way. These are allies. Eye me curiously or compassionately, and then say instead of directly, how does it feel to be a problem, they say, I know an excellent colored person in my town. Or, I fought at Mechanicsville. Virtue signaling. Or, do not these southern outrages make your blood boil? At these I smile, or am interested, or reduced to a boiling simmer as the occasion may require. To the real question, how does it feel to be a problem, I answered seldom a word. It's so contemporary, I think. DuBois doesn't respond because he finds the question, how is it to be a problem, illegitimate. It's not a real question. It's used to place the burden of the problem on somebody else. So DuBois suggests that we avoid the color line because we don't see whiteness. There's another way to avoid it. I don't see color. DuBois makes this point in a 1920 article titled "The Souls of White Folk." He explains the discovery of personal whiteness among the world's peoples is a very modern thing, a 19th and 20th century matter indeed. So he writes about how first learning about white identity, he says this is what happens. The world, in a sudden emotional conversion, has discovered that it is white, and by that token, wonderful. Interesting. So even today, we're trying to deconstruct assumptions about color, the benevolence of America as seen through white eyes, as the hero. DuBois says that most white people don't see their privilege, another trigger term. So he poses this questions to get them thinking. He says this is what he would want to ask white people. How does it feel to belong? How does it feel to be comfortable with who you are? How does it feel to be privileged without knowing it? In other words, how does it feel to be white? Now, whites are often surprised by these questions because sometimes they feel like an accusation and they provoke frustration and anger. I get that. And these frustrations and anger are disrupting many liberal communities trying to talk about this. A few years ago, a main discussion in white communities around the country was who is more woke, right? Everybody wanted to prove that they were more anti-racist than thou. In their efforts to empathize with black people and maybe assuage their own sense of guilt, some white activists morphed into white saviorism. Nowadays, white communities argue about whether woke is even a good thing or not. Those who embrace the label are often accused of just seeking absolution, and those who reject the term are often accused of being racists. It's splitting white communities in two, it's slowing down anti-racism work, and this is tiring the patience of black Americans. Get your shit together, is what I've been told. So these tensions divide me, they reawaken a sense of two-ness, and like many white liberals, I want to be part of the solution, but I feel part of the problem. While I campaign against racism, I represent a system soaked in racism. I'm dedicated to social and economic justice, but I'm a recipient of benefits drawn from racism. Others who do multicultural work are often surprised to discover similar inner division. And some of this two-ness is the result of internalized stereotypes and images of the white oppressor. White guilt, another trigger term, is more a significant source of discomfort because people feel like they're reduced to stereotypes, that they are seen as guilty participants in ill-gotten gains and white privilege. Elizabeth Denevia, diversity consultant I worked with at that school, said, the inequities in such privilege are obviously painful to people of color, but they can also be painful to white people, many of whom feel that it strips them of their individuality and turns them into unappealing stereotypes. Now, not all white people internalize these stereotypes, consciously or unconsciously, but a significant number do. Many whites internalize oppressor images despite working against racism. So I wonder if this division, this wound, is the result of that unpaid debt. Is that it? Is it karmic payback for a legacy of racism? In his book, The Hidden Wound, Wendell Berry writes, if white people have suffered less obviously from racism than black people, they have nevertheless suffered greatly. The cost has been greater, perhaps, than we can yet know. If white people have inflicted the wound of racism upon black people, the cost has been that he would receive the mirror image of that wound into himself. As the master or a member of the dominant race, he has felt little compulsion to acknowledge or speak of it. The more painful it has grown, the more deeply he has hidden it from himself. But the wound is there, and it is a profound disorder, as great a damage in his mind as it is in his society. So after 100 years after DuBois described the problem of two-ness, many whites have to heal too. I know I do. Can white people constructively discuss diverse ways we struggle with the color line so that we can move forward in our work? Because I think if we don't, these inner struggles we're having will manifest in the outside world. That's what psychologist C.G. Jung said. He said, if an inner situation, which in this case is a division caused by racial strife, is not made conscious, it happens on the outside by fate, end quote. When we don't acknowledge and work through inner divisions, whatever they're like, they're not all the same, the world will perforce act out the conflict and be torn into opposing halves. So has this divisions, these fracturings, happened on the outside as fate? Is it a result of the unresolved two-ness? Is it a result of the color line? Maybe. Maybe. Metaphor. What I do know is that we have not achieved the unity of spirit necessary to build racial justice. So let me conclude. I'm not sure of the best way forward, but it has to involve open hearts and open minds. It has to involve curiosity. Often white people with very different perspectives speak with a certain righteous certainty about racism. I do. Today I've tried to put that aside. Today I've tried to lean into curiosity. While I always want to listen to those most harmed by oppression, I want to hear all voices. And racism damages everyone. It's in everybody's interest to end it. That was the main thesis of Heather McGhee's 2021 book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. Nick Sanders has spoken about this book in numerous venues. It reinforces the fact that we can no longer be divided. We have to heal the color line in ourselves, in our community, and in our country. Otherwise, we're going to throw away what McGee talks about as the solidarity dividend. That's the power we can use for good when we manage to work together. Whatever the wounds of historic wounds or the personal wounds we've all suffered, we need to heal those so they don't fester or break out into divisions. We have to face the physical, political, and psychological manifestations of the color line within our humanist faith. Ethical culture teaches us to honor the worth of everyone, to build social justice, and to do so through compassionate ethical relationships. Ethical culture urges us to bring out the best in others. Can we do so together to solve the problem of the color line that seems to be a major problem of the 21st century? Thank you very much.